Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today is the 5th of March, and today we'll be simply analyzing the frontline updates from Velyka Novosilka. Then moving our way to the northeast, looking at the Pokrovsk front, where we have a lot of back and forth fighting between the Russians and Ukrainians, a couple of localized counterattacks. But the largest news will come from the Kursk sector because over the past week, we've seen some significant Ukrainian retreats and Russian advances through largely open areas, including open fields and forested areas, but also into some populated regions. So we're going to look at the entire breakdown of that situation. And then by the end of the video, we will discuss in just sort of cursory glance, and I'm going to get into more details later on, but I do want to discuss the fact that the United States has temporarily halted the shipping of aid to Ukraine, and it could become permanent depending on certain stipulations. And there's also a pause on intelligence sharing with Ukraine. And we're talking about a complete pause, 100%. So we'll discuss the implications of that today. So as we get into the video, please like and subscribe. And over here, you can see on the Velyka Novosilka sector, we have one update, that being this large pocket in gray zone region in between Privilnia and Brulatska has fallen to Russian hands. It's an area amounting to 2 square kilometers of territory, and it's located, if we're going to measure it with a measuring stick, about 2.5 kilometers southeast of Shevchenko, which is the near organization point for a lot of Ukrainian units. But in terms of recent updates, we haven't seen that much because a lot of the Russian focus has been on consolidating their advances both in Brulatska and in eastern Privilnia, because they've not been able to take over the hamlet in its entirety. But footage does show the Russian forces, in terms of just advancing on the ground, actually being able to enter into that village. We also know now about the shadow drone units being called back to the sector. It was previously committed to here and was also moved around with the 72nd Mechanized Brigades of Vuhledar and then to the Andrivka region. But now a lot of the Andrivka garrison, as we're going to get into the video, you'll see that they've actually been split apart, because right now the amount of surface area and the length of the front line around Andrivka is much smaller than it was a couple of months ago when there was that outstanding pockets. And so there's less of a need for a bloated amount of units. So now they're being dispersed elsewhere and given different tasks. So that includes this drone element, which also had a long period of recuperation because they did suffer some pretty significant losses during the entire fall of Vuhledar and then also during the entire collapse of the Andrivka pockets. So they were given several weeks, if not months, of just on and off operational pauses, but it seems now they're getting recommitted. And just on this topic of the Andrivka front, because the Russian forces were involved in so many like really rapid advances in relative terms, their garrison over here is also reached a point where they're not pushing deeper and they're working on recuperating. And the actual efforts that they're conducting on a daily basis are really just involved with pushing the Ukrainians out of Konstantinopel entirely. And so, for the time being, you have this moment of reprieve for the Ukrainian forces in Oleksivka and Bakhatir, which is good for them because they have a chance to actually build up defenses. And then the units that are considered excess, they're going to be moved on elsewhere to areas where they're definitely needed. So I'll give another example as the video goes on. Just to move up northwards over here to the Pokrovsk front, this is where the Ukrainians are taking advantage of the weather, of the low cloud cover, because there's less of a chance for Russian reconnaissance drones to get a picture and understand that the Ukrainians are organizing a counterattack. So they took advantage of that weather and more generally the Russians being outstretched in certain locations and overwhelmed after months of intense fighting and continued advances and continued momentum. Eventually, it reached a breaking point where the Russians were no longer able to continue with the pace of advances. And a lot of units that were involved in the same sort of assaults, they reached a level of fatigue. So the Ukrainians, of course, take advantage of that whenever they sense an opportunity on a geographic level. And one area is Uzbenivka, wherein the Ukrainians have been able to take back the entirety of the village and have turned it into a fortress. And as a result, the Russians now are sort of falling back to Novovasilivka, and they haven't shown signs yet of trying to organize counterattacks. So for now, the front line really has stabilized along this border between these two villages, and the Ukrainians took back 1.3 square kilometers of territory. This is really important because it means that the line, the Solnana River line, has been stabilized, and that Novoserhivka will not fall in the near future, meaning that the border with Donetsk and Dnipro for the time being is also safe. It also means that the southern flank of Udachne isn't entirely compromised and that the Ukrainians can continue to hold on to this location. And more generally, you also see the same thing with Kotlina, and those were some of the earlier counterattacks conducted by the Ukrainians. And so far, they've held The Russians have just been focused on sort of like a stabilization footing, trying to ensure that their line does not get penetrated deeper. And when I'm talking about deeper, I mean pushing south of the T0406 highway and the local rail line and its adjacent windbreaks. That's the objective of the Russians right now. They're not looking at the maximalist objectives that could have been possible a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, when the Russians were, say, 5 kilometers away from the road, the northwestern road, the E50 highway into Pokrovsk. Now the situation has changed. The Ukrainian reinforcements have arrived, and really things have reached standstill. The Ukrainians have been able to achieve this local stabilization that they've really been trying to do for a while, whether it be with the withdrawal to Selidove or like long-standing fighting, dragging it out in Shevchenko. Now they've actually been able to achieve that in this location. To zoom southwards, though, there has been another Ukrainian counterattack launched. This one was actually just today launched. And in the process, the Ukrainians were able to take back zero point 0.9 square kilometers. But it's not about the surface area; it's more so about where the area that was targeted actually was able to reach. So the Russian forces over here, they were pushed back from eastern Shevchenko. There's a geolocation though showing how the Russians from the pseudo plateau of elements, they use VT-40 FPV drones. So those have like RPG warheads and packaging and explosives. So it is pretty small in terms of the size, the warhead weight, but it actually does lead to a pretty high yield and damage to the vehicles that are hit. And so it just shows a large compilation of Ukrainian armored vehicles. At least three separate vehicles were hit, but it could be more based on the compilation video as they were attacking south of the city of Pokrovsk, obviously, and the Shakhtarsky microdistrict, and also just south of the large scale windbreaks over here. So armored vehicles attacked through this open field region. They were able to infiltrate into the first houses in eastern Shevchenko. They were spotted by Russian reconnaissance drones by the time they arrived at that location, and they were struck accordingly. So I should say eastern Shevchenko, now western. There are also about 30 soldiers involved, so a pretty notable amount within each individual vehicle that were dismounted and are now trying to gain a foothold over here. All of the objective of tying up with the Russians in these locations, it's not even necessarily about taking them back in their entirety, because a lot of these areas have turned into pretty notable Russian formations and areas where their troops sort of situates themselves in. So it's more so about just tying up those forces there, even if it's understood on a surface level that the Russian forces in these locations may have certain advantages, as long as they're focusing all of their resources on a very narrow and sort of specific location. They can't look at the broader picture and continue with their own advances, coordinating with other parts of the front line to advance northwards and into Pokrovsk itself. So it's sort of a new sort of way of the Ukrainians have been sort of adopting in order to change the course of the battles over here, change the momentum, and create a new status quo wherein the line sort of stabilize over here in such a way where the Ukrainians have a buffer zone of about, what is this? I'm going to measure from the south over here. They have a buffer zone measuring 3 kilometers or maybe 2.5 kilometers if we're being less generous from Pokrovsk itself. And then also about 5 or 6 kilometers away from the key supply lines like the E50 highway. And this is also coupled with earlier counterattacks from Zhechensk. And when it comes to the region near Yelizavetivka over here, there was also a bit of Ukrainian movement eastwards. So we now know about the Ukrainians still present in this location. We also know that the Ukrainians recently deployed the 157th Mechanized Brigade, which is one of those final units that was a part of the 150 series of brigades created. It's actually one of the final ones that's actually been introduced to the fighting. And now they've been moved away from Andrivka because of their really considered redundant over there, and they've been deployed to the Zelene Pole, Velyka Novosilka region, which is an area that's not seeing intense fighting, but it is absolutely necessary for the Ukrainians to ensure there are not Russian breakthroughs over here. So just plugging the hole and having that sort of insurance policy is important. And so 2,000 plus men being deployed to this region is an important addition for the Ukrainian garrison in that location. Now, to look northwards, I do want to look at Toretsk. Actually, I can't believe I almost missed that, because there is a Ukrainian advance over here, even deeper into the Zabalka microdistrict. The Ukrainians are beginning to expand the size of their pocket over here that is east of Shcherbynivka to such a degree that it will become a formidable sort of location, and more so not just a pocket, but actually a salient that continues to expand. That's what we're seeing based on Ukrainian movements. So they've been able to infiltrate into Western Zabalka, an area that they are very familiar with, because there's been at least three back and forth movements in this specific location in Western Zabalka. since the Russians first entered into the region a couple of maybe half a year ago or a bit less than that. So here's the geolocation for this. So this is from March 5th. There were two Ukrainian attacks that occurred. One of them coming from the southwest, and then another one coming from this sort of northwestern location over here. And each one had two armored vehicles. There were two 113 APCs and then two Kozak armored vehicles. And they attacked not in tandem, one after the other. They attacked. So after the first one was repelled from the south, the one from the north came in, and they were able to position themselves in this geolocated region. But nonetheless, they were destroyed by the Russian side. But based on those geolocations and the dismounts, we were able to ascertain that the Ukrainians are actually located in these regions. And also, these units that were involved in the attack, pushing back the Ukrainians, include the 103rd Regiment and the 147th, 174th Reconnaissance Battalion, which is a part of the 150th Motor Rifle Division, one of the key divisions that is currently situated in the Toretsk region. And a lot of the reinforcements are coming from that specific formation, which previously served around the entire Marinka region, if you recall. So I just have their logos over here just so you guys can see for yourselves on the map. But that's about it for the Toretsk region. When we look a bit to the north at the situation developing on the Zherebets River front, you'll see there was a pretty deep Russian infiltration amounting to 7 square kilometers. And when we look at the distances over here, you can see that it's about 4.5 kilometers in the western direction. So it's not necessarily in the direction of any village, but the Russians over here are trying to expand control along the trench line over here. It's a pretty significant line of defenses. And in the video that you see that was released by the 60th Mechanized Brigade and the 115th Mechanized Brigade, which was recently redeployed to here, it was previously deployed generally around the perimeter of Kupiansk, but now it's fighting southwards. So they're involved in individual grenade drops onto Russian soldiers that were advancing from one trench to the other and through dugouts and Ukrainian fortifications, all with the objective getting control over those sort of this entire line of defenses in order to break through to the west of it, but also to get control over the key heights that are dominating the few local roads that are important over here. Because you just don't see that many roads that connect Ukrainian forces on the rear over here. There are a few, and though they're very notable, and as a result, they're also easy to cut off. And as a result, it would be difficult for the Ukrainians to operate in this entire sector as a whole if they were to be targeted. So you have this road over here from Nove to Stavki, one of the only roads coming down vertically in this location. Then you move to Chandrikholove, and it's another area where you do have a couple of roads branching out. But again, we're looking at just an amount that I could count on a singular hand. So it is absolutely difficult to, ensure that there is a lot of cohesiveness between those various positions. And so the Russians getting control over some higher elevated locations, say 10 kilometers to the east, it's sort of like the basis for eventually firing onto those regions and expanding deeper and deeper. And you could see an area that would be really exposed. I haven't seen any movement towards it yet, but this entire region that is basically to the west of Kolodiasi, it's completely open. There are not defenses over here. And you could also penetrate the Ukrainian rear and then physically cut off a lot of those roads. So that's something that the Ukrainians should be really wary about ignoring. They should be really, really up to date and understanding the potential difficulties with holding on over here and what it could lead to if they don't hold on particularly well. So something to keep an eye out for in the future. Looking to the north over here, you can see the Russian forces were able to advance and take over the entirety of the hamlet of Nadia, and then also east of Stepi. And you could see that they were able to capture 6.7 square kilometers of territory in total. Now, moving a bit to the north, we do have a bit of positional movement just to the east and west of Zaporizhzhia. Nothing too significant to note. 2.5 square kilometers to the east in open fields, and then to the west along the Oskil River bank and the rail line, nearly 1 square kilometer of territory. So that has been captured just around the environs of said village. But I really do want to focus on Kursk over here for a moment. So you can see there are three major updates to look at. First of all, Lebedivka has been taken over in its entirety, and that's probably been the case since the 1st or 2nd of March. You could see that in terms of the extent of the capture, it amounts to nearly 10 square kilometers because it's not just the populated areas, but also all of those open fields to the north. There was simply no ability for the Ukrainians to project power west of the river over here. I believe this is a pond, but it just is an outstretched portion of the Reka Malaya Loknaya River. And so that's the new body of water the Ukrainians have coalesced around. So Loknaya is now sort of the conduit between the front line and the rear, connecting it to the various Ukrainian villages that are still resisting a bit to the north, including most notably the Malaya Loknaya village. So when you look at this region to the north, these really important villages where you have some of the most battle-hardened Ukrainian units currently resisting, from air assault elements or 47th Mechanized Brigade or heavy mechanized units that were formerly tank brigades. There's just a whole host of elements over here, and they've been able to hold out and push back Russian assaults from the western flank for a really long period of time throughout the entirety of winter 2024, 2025. But now you see that just naturally, with the progression of events, they were unable to hold on to the northern flank and thereby have lost 11 square kilometers of territory. When we look at the distance covered, the Russians were able to advance 2.3 kilometers southwards and did so by capturing Orlovka in its entirety, all of Pogrebki, Marivka, and have also entered into Novaya Sorochino. You can see that over here with the geolocation with a Russian flag being raised on March 2nd in this village. And you can see that actually some of the houses are intact and that there wasn't active fighting when the video was released. So for now, I'm just going to mark the rest of the hamlet as a gray zone, but it is possible that the Russian forces involved with that deep push into the village itself are also involved right now in expanding southwards, because the eventual Russian goal, and it's pretty clear now based on the way they're advancing southwards, is to try to squeeze the Ukrainians out of Malaya Loknaya. It's the largest Ukrainian settlement in this region, but you can see over here in Pogrebki is also probably the closest in size if you're looking for similarities. And the Russians were able to push them out pretty quickly once they were able to get the momentum started over a week ago now. So the Russian forces now do have this sort of emboldened position where they're trying to seize additional control over weak points. Now, advancing directly southwards will be difficult at this point because the Ukrainian forces have now been able to coalesce around more dense positions. So even though they may have numerical disadvantages in certain cases, now a lot of their firepower and accumulation of forces is concentrated in a singular region where it could be used to its fullest potential. And we're talking about the various brigades that are really well known and have fought for a long time over here, like the 95th Brigade and like the 79th, like the 22nd Mechanized Brigade, 47th. You have the 1st Tank Brigade, just to list off a few. So you're also going to have to look at the potential of the Russian forces advancing from the east, taking over heights to the east, overlooking the entirety of the river valley wherein the Ukrainians are currently situated, and then applying direct fire onto those positions and physically cutting off the Ukrainian escape routes. So this is something that could also happen as a means of just bypassing the frontal assaults that the Russians had to use in order to capture the first 3 villages in this sort of like spine of Kursk over the past couple of days, which of course, when you're doing these frontal assaults, you can see that it actually did yield success, but definitely due to the intense house fighting, it does also lead to higher attrition rates for both sides. Looking a bit to the east, though, you also have the Russians pushing and consolidating control over a large portion of the open fields and outstretched ravines and forested regions that are located in open fields, or I should say open areas in between Naidenov and Ruskoye Porochnoi. This is an area that just has a chronic lack of Ukrainian forces, but also the Russians are not that committed to it. Although I would say that they really should be committing more resources to here, because there is a significant opportunity for the Russians to then swing in from the sort of eastern direction and then push from that eastern flank directly towards the remaining Ukrainian holdouts in those populated areas. So we'll see if that actually ends up coming into actualization. We could see that at the very least they captured 2.7 square kilometers of territory. Now, as a final note, we do know now, based on reporting from FT, that the United States has cut off intelligence sharing to Ukraine. This will have a whole host of ramifications, and it's also included a ban on American allies from then passing off the aid that they share with those allies to Ukraine. So you can't see a scenario where the UK or France get some sort of important intelligence about Russia, about certain placements of bomber crews or positions for ballistic missile launches. That will not be allowed to be sent to Ukraine. So real-time intelligence sharing or sharing about high-value targets cannot come from the EU or from any EU country if the United States originally shared that information with said countries. So that should be important to note. A lot of systems like HIMARS, ATACMS, and then even some of the non-American weapon systems that still rely on American intelligence, like the Storm Shadows or Scalps, they're going to be affected significantly. because they're not going the Ukrainians will not have access to the real-time updates and the really detailed and thorough observations of those American satellites, those intelligence reconnaissance satellites that are orbiting and getting really specific information about the Russian deployment of forces, the logistics, troop movements, just any sort of individual position needed for a deep strike, whether it be within Ukrainian territory under Russian control or within the actual rear in Russia itself. A lot of those will now be hindered, and Ukrainians will have to rely on the Europeans and maybe some of their AWACS for that. That will require new European commitments, and then the Ukrainians will have to rely on their own intelligence abilities. And you could see them shift focus more to using just long range drones that they were able to retrofit and targeting just Russian oil production facilities. That's going to become a heightened emphasis. I really do believe that now. But at the same time, this is all coupled with the fact that the United States is pausing the aid in general coming into Ukraine, especially when you look at it. There were three ways of giving Ukraine aid from an American perspective. There was the Ukrainian Security Initiative, which now ran out of funds. There's also this Ukrainian, not Ukrainian, but just State Department way of funding foreign militaries. There's a mechanism by which to do that, which was paused a couple of weeks ago due to the executive order signed by Trump. And there was never a waiver granted to Ukraine. There were waivers granted to Israel and Egypt, and I also think to Lebanon now. So they received waivers and they were able to get military equipment, but Ukraine never received one because an official within the Department of State did not sign a letter to the Department of Defense to give a waiver, even though Rubio did actually sign the waiver. It's not enough. So now it's stuck in limbo. So through that State Department mechanism, there cannot be aid sent to Ukraine. And the final way is through the Department of Defense stockpiles directly. And after the recent incident in the Oval Office, that was paused as well per the decision of President Trump. And so now there's zero aid coming in. The final flights have been told to come back, and Ukrainian officials estimate that the new weapons, and we're looking at like small arms and like munitions for tanks and for like mines and stuff like that. That could run out within 2 to 3 months, according to Ukrainian sources. And by then, you'd have a complete phasing out of American systems, besides the higher quality ones, like the HIMARS and the GMLRS rockets. They could run out within the next couple of months at this current rates. And then imagine they're also not going to receive the really precise intelligence sharing that they need. So that's going to become difficult to utilize on the battlefield and for rear strikes like 30 plus kilometers into areas under Russian control. So that's important to note. There's also the issue of air defense. So the Ukrainians will not receive the early warnings needed in order to actually be prepared to intercept the Russian ballistic or cruise missiles or any other form of Russian aerial attack, especially drones, for instance. So the Ukrainians are going to have to rely on their own early warning systems. And then also, they're not receiving new supplies for Patriot batteries. So they're going to eventually run out of Patriot munitions. So we'll have to see how over the next couple of weeks, because of the time frame it's being reported by CNN, is that they could run out of interceptors for the Patriots in a matter of weeks. Obviously, that could be extended if the Ukrainians had to ration it, but then the efficacy, whenever you see them utilized, will be lower because it's just going to be less scale. And so the Ukrainians have to really desperately diversify, and that's going to have to come from Europe. And even if it does come, it's not going to be complete, whether in quantity or quality. And even if it does end up coming, because there was some sort of consensus in Europe and an agreement to sign additional forms of aid and also increase their own individual intelligence sharing directly from Europe, it's going to take time. And so there's going to be a process, a limbo process, during that transition period away from the American aid, the aid that's coming in from all those American, transport planes that drop off in Poland and then go to Ukraine, and then also all of the American intelligence sharing. There's going to have to be that extremely painful phase of transition. And even after that's done, there's no guarantee that the Ukrainian new sort of apparatus and means of organizing their military and conducting strategic operations, there's no guarantee that it will be any better and will be in a situation to continue. So what I mean to say really is that the situation, even with this continued situation, status quo, where in the United States will just cut off all supports, it's not catastrophic in any immediate sense, but it will just lead to the exacerbation of already existing issues and make it more difficult on a daily basis for Ukrainian soldiers on the front line and those operating on the rear. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.